It's Friday. Who'da thunk it? Well, since it's Friday, and since I told you what I was going to do last week was a furtherance of what we explored before, this wonderful book is what I'm going to be delving into. It is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And just to help you remember, these are all letters that Coates actually wrote to his adolescent son, and trying to get him to understand who he was, where he was, what was happening in the world. And one of the many things I loved about this book, which has great richness in it, and I encourage you to explore it, I'm just giving you a little taste, is that he supports something I believe in, that poetry is not in and of itself just isolated. It can be used to illuminate prose, and each of the three sections, and the book indeed itself, is introduced by a different poem, by a different poet. Now, we're going to, in this final presentation, be looking at section 2, and it begins with a poem by Amiri Baraka. And it goes. Our world is full of sound. Our world is more lovely than anyone's, though we suffer and kill each other, and sometimes fail to walk the air. We are beautiful people, with African imaginations full of masks and dances and swelling chants, with African eyes and noses and arms, though we sprawl in grey chains in a place full of winters, when what we want is sun. And we begin. Remember, these are letters he wrote to his son. Shortly before you were born, I was pulled over by the PG County Police. PG is the way he refers to Prince George's County Police. The same police that all the D.C. poets had warned me of. They approached on both sides of the car, shining their flashing lights through the windows. They took my identification and returned to the squad car. I sat there in terror. By then, I had added to the warnings of my teachers what I'd learned about the PG County through reporting and reading the papers. And so I knew that the PG County Police had killed Elmer Clay Newman, then claimed he'd rammed his own head into the wall of a jail cell. Oh, and I knew they'd shot Gary Hopkins and said he'd gone for an officer's gun. And I knew they had beaten Freddie McCollum half blind and blamed it all on a collapsing floor. And I had read reports of these officers choking mechanics, shooting construction workers, slamming subjects through the glass doors of shopping malls. And I knew that they did this with great regularity, as though moved by some unseen cosmic clock. I knew they shot at moving cars, shot at the unarmed, shot through the backs of men, and claimed that it had been they who had been under fire. These shooters were investigated, exonerated, and promptly returned to the streets, where, so emboldened, they shot again. At that point in American history, no police department fired its guns more than that of Prince Georges County. Oh, the FBI opened multiple investigations, sometimes in the same week. The police chief was rewarded with a raise. I played all of this sitting there in my car, in their clutches. Better to have been shot in Baltimore, where there was the justice of the streets, and someone might call the killer to account. But these officers had my body, could do with that body whatever they pleased. And should I live to explain what they had done with it, this complaint would mean nothing. The officer returned. He handed back my license. He gave no explanation for the stop. Then that September I picked up the Washington Post and saw that the PG County Police had killed again. I could not help but think this could have been me. And holding you, a month old by then, I knew that such loss would not be mine alone. I skimmed the headline. Their atrocities seemed so common back then. The story spread into a second day, and reading slightly closer, I saw it was a Howard student who had been killed. I thought perhaps I knew him, but I paid it no further mind. Then, on the third day, a photo appeared with the story, and I glimpsed at, and then focused on, the portrait. And I saw him there. He was dressed in his formal clothes, as though it were a senior prom, and frozen in the amber of his youth. His face was lean, brown, and beautiful. And across that face I saw the open, easy smile of Prince Carmen Jones. I cannot remember what happened next. I think I stumbled back. I think I told your mother what I'd read. I think I called the girl with the long dreads and asked her, could this be true? I think she screamed. What I remember for sure is that what I felt, rage, and the old gravity of West Baltimore. The gravity that condemned me to the schools, the streets, the void. Prince Jones had made it through, and still they had taken him. And even though I already knew that I would never believe any account that justified this taking, I sat down and I read the story. There were very few details. He had been shot by a PG County officer, not in PG County, not even in D.C., but somewhere in northern Virginia. Prince had been driving to see his fiancée. He was killed yards from her home. The only witness to the killing of Prince Jones was the killer himself. The officer claimed that Prince had tried to run him over with his jeep, and I knew that the prosecutors would believe him. Days later, your mother and I packed you into the car, drove down to Washington, left you with your Aunt Camilla, and went to the service for Prince at Rankin Chapel on Howard's campus, where I'd once sat amazed at the parade of activists and intellectuals. Joseph Lowry, Cornel West, Calvin Butts, who preached at that pulpit. I must have seen a great number of old friends there, though I cannot recall precisely who. What I remember is all the people who spoke of Prince's religious zeal, his abiding belief that Jesus was with him. I remember watching the president of the university stand and weep. I remember Dr. Marble Jones, Prince's mother, speaking of her son's death as a call to move her from her comfortable suburban life into activism. I heard several people ask for forgiveness for the officer who'd shot Prince Jones down. I only vaguely recall my impression of all this, but I know that I have always felt great distance from the grieving rituals of my people, and I must have felt it powerfully then. The need to forgive the officer would not have moved me, because even then, in some inchoate form, I knew that Prince was not killed by a single officer, so much as he was murdered by his country and all the fears that have marked it from birth. At this moment, the phrase police reform has come into vogue, and the actions of our publicly appointed guardians have attracted attention, presidential and pedestrian. You may have heard the talk of diversity, sensitivity training, and body cameras. These are all fine and applicable, but they understate the task and allow the citizens of this country to pretend that there is real distance between their own attitudes and those of the ones appointed to protect them. Truth is that the police reflect America in all of its will and fear. And whatever we might make of this country's criminal justice policy, it cannot be said that it was imposed by a repressive minority. The abuses that have followed from these policies, the sprawling carceral state, the random detention of black people, the torture of suspects, are the product of democratic will. And so, to challenge the police is to challenge the American people who send them into the ghettos armed with the same self-generated fears that compelled the people who think they are white to flee the cities and into the dream. Problem with the police is not that they are fascist pigs, but that our country is ruled by majoritarian pigs. I knew some of this even then, sitting in Rankin Chapel, even if I could not yet express it. So forgiving the killer of Prince Jones would have seemed irrelevant to me. The killer was the direct expression of all his country's beliefs. And raised conscious, in rejection of a Christian God, I could see no higher purpose in Prince's death. I believed, and still do, that our bodies are ourselves, that my soul is the voltage conducted through neurons and nerves, and that my spirit is my flesh. Prince Jones was one of one. And they had destroyed his body, scorched his shoulders and arms, ripped open his back, mangled lung, kidney, and liver. I sat there, feeling myself a heretic, believing only in this one-shot life and the body. For the crime of destroying the body of Prince Jones, I did not believe in forgiveness. When the assembled mourners bowed their heads in prayer, I was divided from them, because I believed that the void would not answer back. Weeks wore on. Nauseating details slowly dribbled out. The officer, was a known liar. A year earlier, he had arrested a man on false evidence. Prosecutors had been forced to drop every case in which the officer was involved. Now, the officer was demoted, restored, then put out on the street to continue his work. Now, through additional reports, a narrative began to take shape. The officer had been dressed like an undercover drug dealer. He'd been sent out to track a man whose build was 5'4" and 250 pounds. We know from the coroner that Prince's body was 6'3" and 211 pounds. We know that the other man was apprehended later. The charges against him were dropped. None of this mattered. We know that his superiors sent this officer to follow Prince from Maryland through Washington, D.C., into Virginia, where the officer shot Prince several times. We know that the officer confronted Prince with his gun drawn and no badge. We know the officer claims he shot because Prince tried to run him over with his Jeep. We know that the authorities charged with investigating this shooting did very little to investigate the officer and did everything in their power to investigate Prince Jones. This investigation produced no information that would explain why Prince Jones would suddenly shift his ambitions from college to cop killing. This officer, given maximum power, bore minimum responsibility. He was charged with nothing. He was punished by no one. He was returned to his work. There were times when I imagined myself, like Prince, tracked through many jurisdictions by a man in a criminal's costume. And I was horrified, because I knew what I would have done with such a man confronting me, gun drawn, mere feet from my own family's home. "Take care of my baby," your grandmother had said, which was to say, take care of your new family. But I now knew the limits of my caring, the reach of its powers, etched by an enemy old as Virginia. I thought of all the beautiful black people I'd seen at the Mecca, all their variation, all their hair, all their language, all their stories and geography, all their stunning humanity, and none of it could save them from the mark of plunder and the gravity of our particular world. And it occurred to me then that you would not escape, that there were awful men who'd laid plans for you, and I could not stop them. Prince Jones was the superlative of all my fears, and if he, good Christian, scion of a striving class, patron saint of the twice as good, could be forever bound, who then could not? And the plunder was not just of Prince alone. Think of all the love poured into him. Think of the tuitions for Montessori and music lessons. Think of the gasoline expended, the treads worn, carting him to football games, basketball tournaments, and Little League. Think of the time spent regulating sleepovers. Think of the surprise birthday parties, the daycare, and the reference checks on babysitters. Think of World Book and childcraft. Think of checks written for family photos. Think of credit cards charged for vacations. Think of soccer balls, science kits, chemistry sets, racetracks, and model trains. Think of all the embraces, all the private jokes, customs, greetings, names, dreams of all the shared knowledge and capacity of a black family injected into the vessel of flesh and bone. And think of how that vessel was taken, shattered on the concrete, and all its holy contents, all that had gone into him, sent flowing back to the earth. Think of your mother, who had no father, and your grandmother, who was abandoned by her father, and your grandfather, who was left behind by his father. And think of how Prince's daughter was now drafted into those solemn ranks and deprived of her birthright. That vessel which was her father, which brimmed with 25 years of love, and was the investment of her grandparents, and was to be her legacy. Now at night, I held you in a great fear. Wide as all our American generations took me. Now, I personally understood my father. And the old mantra, either I can beat him or the police. I understood it all. The cable wires, the extension cords, the ritual switch. Black people love their children with a kind of obsession. You are all we have. And you come to us endangered. I think we would like to kill you ourselves before seeing you killed by the streets that America made. That is a philosophy of the disembodied, of a people who control nothing, who can protect nothing, who are made to fear not just the criminals among them, but the police, who lord over them with all the mortal authority of a protection racket. It was only after you that I understood this love, that I understood the grip of my mother's hand. Oh, there's more in this book. And the last chapter, which I haven't shared with you, he actually goes to Prince's mother, and there is a heartfelt discussion after that. If you want a thoughtful read that will help give you a more humane perspective on the world we face, please do take a look at this book. It awaits you at Story and Song. Now, with our limited time, I'm back to Shakespeare. I'm back to poetry for kids, my all-time favorite line of books. And of course, with what I just read, could anyone follow that but Shakespeare? And the answer is yes, but I choose to make Shakespeare the follower. From Richard III, Act 1, Scene 1. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by his son of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry greetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war hath summoned his wrinkled front. And now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking glass, I that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton, ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of features by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into the breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why, I, in this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time, unless to see my shadow in the sun, and descant on mine own deformity. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, to entertain these fair well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain, and hate the idle pleasures of these days. And you can see a wonderful bit of artistry in the illustration. There are so many more pieces of poetry here that will help us understand more fully the sweep of years and humanity. in these two books. Thank you for sharing Friday with me. I look forward to next Friday. Till then,